This is the Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 8th chapter. Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." This is the gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God, and you may be seated. So the other day, I'm at the grocery store, and the cashier greets me, and then I return the greeting by saying, "Hey, how are you doing?" Now, instead of saying good, fine, or okay, he immediately goes into this long description of how badly he is doing. Now, this is a perfect stranger. And I don't mind at all when somebody that I know, when I say, "Hey, how are you doing?" Just for the record, I care about that person. I really do want to know how they're doing, whether it's good, bad, or otherwise. But this was a perfect stranger. And I'm starting to feel a little bit uncomfortable because I really don't want to know how he's doing. I just was saying, "Hey, how are you?" I wanted him to say, "Okay, fine," or "Doing okay, doing well." So as he's describing, going on this long litany of things that are going on in his life, Paul, my son, my 3-year-old, is over in the candy aisle, and he's yelling, "I want Skittles, Dad! I want Skittles! I want them now!" And he's starting to throw a temper tantrum, and parents all around come out of the woodwork, and they all are seeing how this is all going to turn out because he wants Skittles and M&Ms, and I'm trying to pay attention to this guy. Didn't he know the right way of answering that question? So on the way home, I started to think about this very common greeting that we use with one another. How are you doing? Then I started to think that most of the time we really don't want to know how the other person is doing. What then does this question say about our culture? First, I think we might be afraid of suffering and pain. We are afraid of our own, and we are most especially afraid of other people's pain. I started to get a little bit uncomfortable at this guy when he went into a long description about what was going on in his life. He was, after all, a perfect stranger. But most of all, this question seems to communicate that we live in a culture where we want to deny that there is suffering. There seems to be this expectation, and I think this is especially true in the Midwest, that we are fine. Everything is just fine. I'm fine, you're fine, we're all just fine. We never want to admit that we are not doing well. I once worked with a young man in therapy when I was working as a therapist who lost both of his parents in 6 months. Can you imagine that? Losing both parents in the span of 6 months. And throughout our first sessions together, he kept saying through his tears, I'm fine, it'll be okay, it's really no big deal, I'll get over it." Most of what we did together was to work through all of that denial and to help him say that it is not fine. And losing parents, especially 2 parents in 6 months, is a really big deal. It's okay not to be fine. It's okay to feel pain. Peter, in our gospel for today, also appeared to be afraid of suffering and pain. Jesus is teaching his disciples that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders. Jesus even taught that he was going to die. Peter clearly did not like this at all and took Jesus aside and started to rebuke him. And I can just imagine what that conversation must have been like. Perhaps it went something like this. Peter saying, "Now, Jesus, I know that you are the Messiah, but clearly you don't know what a Messiah is. A Messiah is one who prevents people from suffering, not one who actually suffers. And the other thing, Jesus, is that a Messiah is not one that is put to death. This is not what Messiahs do, Jesus." Peter is denying the whole fact that Jesus must suffer. And this section of gospel sort of foreshadows Peter's threefold denial of Jesus when Jesus is finally put to death. Peter was starting to feel uncomfortable at the whole notion that Jesus must suffer. Peter wanted everything to be just fine. We're fine, Jesus. We're just fine. Peter wanted Jesus to simply rescue him. And just a few weeks ago, we had the transfiguration of Jesus, and there we read about Peter who wanted to simply stay on that mountain and to be just fine with Jesus and the rest of their friends. He turned to Jesus on that mountain and said, "Let's stay here. Let's build a few structures. Let's just stay here and be fine." Perhaps he wanted to stay on that mountain to avoid the suffering in life. I must say, I like Peter a lot, and I think he would have been a great fit in our Midwestern culture where we like to say, everything is fine. I'll be fine. You'll be fine. We're all fine, even when we're not fine. Peter, just like you and me, wanted everything to be okay. He did not want to suffer, and certainly he did not want to see Jesus, his mentor and friend, suffer. Jesus has a strong reaction to Peter's rebuke, and he said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Jesus then goes on to say, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." Jesus is saying many things in this text, and one of the things Jesus is saying is that we're going to suffer in life. We have to accept it. Follow me. Peter and perhaps many of us want a religion and a life where we can escape suffering, where we can have complete security, and where we always have the feeling of being 100% protected in all that we do. We are tempted to want the same things as Peter, where we can have a God that helps us to avoid the crosses of life and the suffering of life altogether. So why do it? Why follow a Messiah who suffers? Why follow a crucified Christ? We follow a crucified Christ because he knows what it's like to suffer. Jesus walked on this earth and experienced great pain and loss. Jesus experienced excruciating pain when he was beaten and then nailed to a cross. Jesus models for us the importance of not running away from our suffering, but rather facing our suffering. Running from our suffering will only make it worse. Instead, we are called to bring our suffering to God and allow God to transform our suffering into new life. Suffering is a part of life. We can't avoid it. But we can bring our suffering to God, to the cross, and God suffers with us, and God transforms our pain, God transforms our suffering into new life. But how do we know? How do we know that God will transform our suffering and our pain into new life? We know because of the cross. The cross is the ultimate symbol of how Jesus takes our suffering and transforms it into new life. The cross was a symbol of death and a symbol of pain. It was an execution tool used by the Roman government. But then when Jesus was raised to new life on that Easter morning, Jesus transformed the cross from a symbol of suffering and a symbol of death into a symbol of new life. The cross is a symbol of suffering transformed. Everyone in the world has suffered in some way. Babies are hardwired for struggle as they learn to walk, talk, eat, and thrive. Young children continue to suffer and struggle as they learn each new skill. And children learn the hardness of death when they lose a pet or even a loved one. And the struggle that we call life develops and changes through the years. Each and every one of us bears a cross or a suffering of some kind. We all have stuff that we carry. In our gospel today, Jesus encourages us to pick up our cross, to pick up our suffering and follow him. It is no use avoiding our suffering or to try and have the things of the world transform our suffering. It is Jesus who transforms our suffering into new life. And when we suffer, we do not suffer alone. God suffers with us. God weeps with us. God, through Jesus Christ, knows what it's like to go through the hard times in life. And we also know, because of the cross, that God will take our suffering and transform it into new life. And we know that when we die, our suffering will be taken away and our death will be transformed into new life with God in heaven. God has also gifted us the church, you and me. And this is the place where we can bring our struggles and where you don't have to be okay 100% of the time. You don't have to be fine 100% of the time. Martin Luther once said that churches are a hospital for sinners and not a museum for saints. So the world invites us to deny all of the things that we're going through, to accept our suffering rather, and to not pretend that everything is okay, but rather to pick up our suffering and follow Christ. We, the Church of Christ, are called to follow Christ and to be with Jesus. We are called by Jesus to claim our suffering, name our suffering, and bring it to the foot of the cross where it will be transformed. So then, what are we to say when someone asks that question? How are you doing? Well, perhaps we could say, I'm floating in God's amazing grace. And this is good news. Amen.